This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our guest today, Mr. Elias Amidon. He is the spiritual director of the Sufi-way International. He has been an initiate of the Sufi-way for the past 42 years. He is also studied with Buddhist teachers in Thailand, Native American teachers, and Christian monks. Elias, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. And while I have the moment, I want to thank you both for making a forum like this possible. I think it's really important in our time that these kind of conversations can happen. Mm-hmm. So good for you.
Thank you, Elias. Why don't we begin by having listeners who haven't heard about you or your work with Open Path become familiar a bit with you and your background. Can you just sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of how you came to discover Sufism and what the origins of your path were?
Well, okay, now that I'm 72 years old, to fit, one collects more and more stories from a very, diverse life. So to fit it all on my thumbnail, well, interrupt me if I go on too long. How I became, as a little kid, I was a pretty happy kid, and actually still am. And out of that, and I was nurtured in that in a loving family, and my father was an artist, my mother a social activist, and that was quite a embracing, almost universalist view that they shared, although neither of them were particularly religious or anything. In fact, they were allergic to most of religious expression, but it didn't seem to matter. I had several spontaneous mystical experiences as a little one, and then I was a war baby, so that put me right in line to be a child of the 60s and the whole psychedelic experiences that many of us went through at that time, which kind of opened the gates to the real, as we say, or that which is hidden in plain sight. But of course, like many of my contemporaries, found that sacred medicines of various sorts were good at cracking open the door, but they weren't particularly. There's no way to stay there and to develop a real, let's say, foundation for a deeply spiritual and intimate life. So I soon began to search for. I was pretty naive back then, and I thought there must be some people in the world who know the truth. That's how I said it to myself, and I think it was through Gurdjieff and some of his writings that I first heard about Sufis, and I thought, they sounded very esoteric and exotic, and maybe those people do know. And I kept, I kept my eyes open for that word and what they were, and very luckily found a Sufi teacher who was perfect for me. A Sufism that, most people think of Sufism as the mystical school of Islam. Well, in the tradition that I became part of and still am, is recognizes Sufism as predating Islam. It's basically the mystic journey of humans as it goes, and it certainly got drenched in Islamic culture for a long time, but and continues to be. Our path and tradition always recognizes and has the universal quality of the mystic, let's say the project of awakening. And and so that we have let's say, a non-sectarian approach to awakening.
Right. Elias, if I could interrupt you for a second and ask a
Please
question
do.
that I'm curious about, and that is that when one becomes a Sufi or takes the Sufi way, is it a
Yeah.
decision? Is it a step? Is there an initiation? Is there an instruction? Is there some point at which you're a Sufi one day, but you weren't the day before? That you cross some threshold?
Good question. Yeah.
Is there, like, for instance, in Christianity, there's baptism.
Yeah.
How does it work with Sufism?
Yeah. Well, it's ours is, like you say, it's an initiatic tradition. So because it goes from generation to generation, and it wasn't just something made up. It has this cumulative, like a stream of what we think of as a stream of blessing that is trans-historical, and it's not just ours. There are, it's a great tapestry, you could say, of this stream of blessing. But yes, you do. If you want to become an initiate, then you ask for an initiation, and it's a simple ceremony. We are not. We try to downplay the tendency of groups like this to become the tendency to become a cult or an in-group or anything like that. We're really uncomfortable with that. So it is, yes, there is a process of becoming a member or a murid, a student, an initiate, and yet it's we downplay that, the division between those who are initiated and those who are not. It's sort of initiation basically means that the person realizes that awakening and service, which is our reason for being, is central to their lives. And in a way, that it's simply a matter of standing before the universe more than anything and saying, this is where my heart is. This is where my path lies in this ever unfolding awakening. And when one it comes to that, then they ask for initiation, and what that gives is it's a lifelong friendship of sometimes it's guidance, sometimes it's consolation, but a kind of a community of friendship of fellow, I want to avoid the word seeker exactly, but companions on the path, let's say.
And Elias, your particular lineage, because there are many lineages within Sufism, apparently traces back to Inayat Khan, and many of us who, as you suggested earlier, were seekers in the 60s and are familiar with him and may have read some of the books or works he left behind. But he passed sometime in the 20s. So who was your teacher and the sort of successor in the lineage?
Yeah. I'll try to avoid getting too long-winded here too, because it's a whole. There was a whole series of there are four major tariqas or branches that came out of his original work, and I was lucky enough to, in a way, to find the one that was at least had the accurate, the most intact succession of peers or leaders. I mean, it went basically from him to his brother, to his cousin, to his younger brother, to his nephew, the grandson of Inayat Khan, and that was my teacher, Fazal Inayat Khan. The son is the one, Vilayat. Pir Vilayat he's passed now, but he was the most famous and well-known of the scions of Inayat Khan. My teacher was much less known and much more interested in not getting huge, not having a big movement, but working with people in a much more intimate and small scale. We would have. I mean, I was at a Sufi center and lived there for 5 years in England, and it was somewhere between 25 and 40 people at a time. So that kind of hothouse, that's, in a way, Sufism used to be that, in the sense it has been an oral tradition predominantly, and working with on a one-to-one or small group basis. And we're still that way. We're dedicated to this, let's say, this kind of depth of inquiry and discipline, and yet, well, enough said.
Yeah, Elias, in your day, is there always time put aside for spiritual exercise? And if so, what type of spiritual exercise do you and practice, and is it associated with your being a Sufi?
That's several questions wrapped in one, and I'll try to go to the last point for a moment. Being a Sufi is a slightly awkward term. You can't really be a Sufi. You can't even. There is not even, as from our view, there's not even a Sufism. It's not really an ism like that. It is. To be a Sufi, it's more to aspire to a Sufi ideal, which is awake, present, compassionate, all the beautiful words that we have, and to embrace all of life, as my teacher would say, be interested in everything, and or play the whole piano, the whole thing, and so. In terms of daily practice, wow, that varies in many ways. But
well, the reason I asked, let me figure this out, Elias, because
yeah.
when I think of most of our listeners, when I think of Sufis, I think of people being, a whirling dervish. I've also talked to Sufis that are more into the silent meditative aspect of Sufism, where they go to the heart. And so I think most of us think of Sufis as that religion, or as a one where the emphasis is on experience as opposed to just doctrine. And is that the case in your case? And what is it? Dancing and being a whirling dervish? Is it going inward into the heart, or is it none of those?
Thanks for the clarification of the question. Yeah, I would say, well, we certainly don't. We're not whirling dervishes types. So that's Mevlevi's particular branch. No, we understand our whatever Sufism is as being these three aspects. It's experiential, as you mentioned, direct experience, instead of just a lot of doctrine and talk. It's inclusive. That let's just say it's universal, but it means that whatever works, I'm a student of Dzogchen, Tibetan Dzogchen, as well as Zen, as well as Christian mysticism. So it's inclusive of all forms of practice, and even devotion. I mean, I'll go to Mass as easily as I'll go to a mosque and pray with them, or it doesn't matter. That's not. There's no impediment there. And the third, experiential, inclusive, and non-definitive. That is, it's a nice word. Non-definitive means we're not going to stick with it's not a religion in the sense of having any kind of dogma or an ideology behind it, in the sense of a storyline, a narrative. So it's wide open, and the work that I do, I call it now the open path, and really sufi-way, open path are really synonymous. But it has the open path, which is predominantly how we show up in the world through trainings and retreats, called that. It's really without. Some people think, in order to do this work, I'd have to be a Sufi. and it's sort of an impediment because I have to jump into some kind of sectarian view. It isn't like that. So it's wide open. This open path is actually the one we're all traveling on, actually. It's ours. It's intimately yours and mine, and everyone who's listening to this. And that welcome and invitation, to me, has a profound power to It's not like becoming something special. It's becoming what we are, and like I said, embracing life fully, whether it's activism or meditation and quiet. I mean, the whole smorgasbord. It's ours.
Elias, in your own personal background, you have drawn on the mystical branches of most of the world's traditions, and you make a point of defining the open way as well as the open path as a path that's by definition open to all of these sources. Yeah. Do you find that people in opening up to this kind of eclecticism and free, open-sourced spirituality, that kind of approach has been sometimes criticized as being a sort of spiritual promiscuity where people don't go deep into anything. Yeah. Do you find that a danger? I wouldn't think it would be in your case because you've been at it for probably half a century now. But exactly. But with newer people, do you find that a distraction or a danger?
Oh, yeah, we're quite aware of it and express it. Just very similar to how you have this kind of the tendency to have a cafeteria-style religion now, and this syncretic, coming from different sources. Yeah, it is a danger, but in our approach, it's sort of we're committed to direct experience, and that's where all of these traditions, if they're authentic, they come in a sense together. We're really speaking of and pointing out and inviting this primal awakening that's common to all of us, whether it's Buddha, Jesus, you, or me. It's the same, quote, enlightenment, and as you know, it's ever present. In terms of rigorousness of our way is quite rigorous because we're, as you know, the awakening is quite commonly referred to now as, hey, it's right here, it's all awake. We are actually naturally enlightened, yes, and so the awakening is quite direct, this direct path, as it's called. And yet, there's some controversy with the graduated paths that, you need a lot of discipline and you have to focus in a particular line or tradition in order to get to the point of direct awakening. Yes, I don't know if we have to follow a specific religious line, although that's not, that's fine if one wants to do that, but there is still, what could I say, it's what Sufis call a process of unlearning. And yes, we can get immediate glimpses of the truth or the real, but to sustain them in our lives and to have them drop all the way through, as you know, we see it as a process of unlearning rather than adding more storyline. Unlearning, we do this through various types of self-inquiry and recognizing the ephemeral quality of thoughts and our mind stream and so on, and what we assume our identities to be. And as you know, that can be quite. There's so many overlays of that build up over a lifetime. That the sense of our self-identity is quite something. There's something that has to be seen, noticed, and released in a rigorous way. So I don't know if that quite answered your question, but in our particular path, it is. It's not that we're going to name it as the Sufi path here, but it is the process that we're after. That is freeing ourselves from assumptions and self-identity. There's work to be done usually there,
right.
And yet there's no work to be done at all in the awakening to what already is here.
This is what I'm trying to understand. So the open path is the approach to spiritual realization offered by the Sufi-way, and that you have trainings and retreats. Let's say retreats held in the U.S. and Europe that are dedicated to direct experience of natural state. So, on the one hand, I'm hearing it's all natural, it's all there, there's nothing to do. On the other hand, you do have retreats, you do have courses that people take, and is it sequential in that? Right, first you go to level A, then level B, level C. If somebody's listening and they're thinking, yeah, I'd love to have an experience of non-duality. I've been hearing about it a long time. Is there a systematic approach to it, or do I go to a teacher and does the teacher tell me you're already there? And he says, well, no, I'm not. I've had this discussion with other people, and I think I understand.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, you're there, and you're enlightened. Okay, well, if I'm enlightened, then, throw me under the bus. But, so I would just like some clarification or your thoughts on that, because that comes up all the time when I talk to people about non-duality. Yeah.
I'm sure. And we have our kind of bread and butter or meat and potatoes is a 9-month training that goes on there. So in a sense it's sequential, and there's a book that I wrote called The Open Path, Recognizing Non-Dual Awareness, and that's basically the manual or the workbook for the course. But it's you can do it. You don't have to take the course, the training. Just read the book. I suppose you'd have to do a lot of the exercise there, and it's helpful to have a community to go through this with. But and there is, if you look at the book, there's a whole sequence of process there. I'd avoid the word systematized because it tends to be spontaneous when we're working with people as well. Yes, there's a sequence, and there's a lot of pointing out along the way. So some people pop, let's say, early on, and others it may take. They can. We've had people taking the 9-month training 3, 4, 5 times. So because they begin to get more and more familiar with it. Right now we're developing a kind of advanced open path training, just because there's so many people who've done it and would like to take it to a deeper level. And I've started doing that with retreats. I just came from one in Austria and in Germany, and called A Joyous Cosmology, and that one was all for graduates. And yes, we could fly a lot easier than having to go through the initial stages, introductory work. So I think there's room for a little more graduated aspect that's developing that way.
Elias, as you know, the term non-dual and non-duality have become quite favorable buzzwords these days in spiritual circles, and in some instances, the term duality is kind of used as almost like an insult. or a pejorative, like, oh, you're so dual. That's just duality. So I'm curious what your take is on that kind of approach to non-duality, and because you mentioned earlier prayer practice, which a lot of non-dual ideologues would dismiss as being merely dualistic. And so, what is your take on that?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a good one. It's a little silly. Those people who might say that are non-dual means non-dual. That is, that means it has to include it all, which it all would include whatever we're talking about as duality. Mm-hmm. So there is no such thing as. That's what our minds do. Non-dual is over here,
right?
Duality is over there. But then you've just destroyed the whole sense of what non-duality is pointing to. There is no division at all between the relative world, the dual world, and non-dual reality. It's the whole thing. It's the whole show. Well, your question about prayer, they actually have a whole chapter of that in the Open Path book on non-duality and prayer. And yes, prayer it's correct to see it as a dualistic enterprise in that, okay, there's me, the penitent here, and then I'm addressing or communicating to a God entity somehow there. So there is this, it's seemingly there's a division between over here and over there. The sacred is over there and here. Well, I find that prayer, which we use, and especially spontaneous prayer, but there are liturgical, I've, with my wife, produced 2-3 books on prayers: earth prayers, life prayers, prayers for 1,000 years, the prayers of humanity. Okay, they're so kind because they start where we are. They start with us, with a kind of compassionate sense of, okay, here, let me express outward, sure, for a petition, for an answer to my prayer, that might be one way. Another way of praying is gratitude or praise, or simply, Sufis are really good at using love language in their prayers. It's almost like a love affair they're having with what they call the beloved or the friend. Mm-hmm. It's so intimate that prayer, in this case, allows one to make love songs. That's the problem with a completely, let's say, when you abandon all of the vocabulary of what we would call duality, that is I and thou, you're kind of stuck with not being able to have any love play with the universe. Mm-hmm. So just as long as you treat it lightly, it is a play, and it also, prayer can also be a kind of practice where you empty out your sense of the importance of the me, and open to in intimacy to the presence of the all, of this that is actually producing us and is gifting us with being.
Elias, I have one final question for you.
Sure.
Say somebody comes to you, and I think we've all been in this situation, and it's a young person, maybe a college student, and they say, I've heard about spirituality. I'm looking for deeper meaning in life. I'm looking for more depth. There must be more to life than what I'm experiencing. What do you recommend to them? What would you say to them if somebody came to you tomorrow and asked you that question?
Well, it would depend, but of course, I'd say, well, if you're curious, and if this has a good, come to something that we're doing, mm-hmm. Okay, and get it, if that's your taste, if this style fits you, great, then come further. Or if it isn't, I'd have to ask more about that person's, predilections, but you might want to go in this direction. Since I know quite a few of the different, the styles of the different spiritual journeys,
Right.
I might be able to point out. I wouldn't have to grab that person for my own. That's not, we're not aggrandizing in that way. So I would suggest one thing is that to go quiet, actually to have periods in their day or week in which they'd pause, they'd turn off all the electronic stuff and be alone. So go quiet, solitude. Give yourself at least an hour or two a week, if not more, to be alone, and basically, if possible, alone in nature. Nature is the greatest teacher. So if you just, for years, my wife and I have been taking people out, on vision quests, or we call them wilderness quests, where people are alone for 3-4 days in the wilderness. And if this person who hypothetically came to me seemed to be attuned to that, I'd say, do that. It's totally life-changing to have that kind of quiet in the midst of nature.
Right. I think that's great advice, and it actually next time somebody asks me that whole experience of solitude, quietness, so many people don't get that. Phil, any final questions, points you'd want to make?
No, I would invite Elias to tell our listeners how they can find out more about him and his work on the web or any books. And I know you have a book coming out soon, Elias. We're recording this in July of 2016. And I know you have a book coming out soon, so let our listeners know about it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, to find out more about us and what we're doing, either The Open Path, it might be easier to remember that, .org, one word, The Open Path, or sufi-way.org.
Well, we'll have that posted up on our podcast.
Oh, okay, that's cool. And then there's the Open Path book that's out, and the new one that's about to come is called Free Medicine, Meditations on Non-Dual Awakening. And it's actually a compilation of 40 different meditations that I've written over the years. They're quite personal in nature. I've done a lot of activism in various countries around the world, in the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So a lot of these stories and my experiences through my life kind of show up in these pieces. What I enjoy about this little book, it's a small book, is that it's each piece is probably 2, 3, 4 pages at most. So it's something you can dip into and kind of get a lift or a view, and then put it down, and go on with your day. So it's accessible in that way. So that's called Free Medicine.
Right.
Very
Elias,
good.
Thank you so very much for your time. And we appreciate it. And I hope you can come back again sometime. We can go a little bit more deeper into the subject matter, but this is a great starting point.
I enjoyed it.
Very thought-provoking.
Wonderful. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.